Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. I also want to thank the sponsor for today's video, Miracle. Are you tired of having filthy sheets, musty towels, and frequent laundry? Well, Miracle has the solution. Premium, antibacterial linens made with pure, natural silver. Miracle products require laundry 3 times less frequently than traditional linens. No more bacteria equals no more odors. Miracle products also can help improve skin health by eliminating acne-causing bacteria. Pure natural silver prevents the growth of bacteria by twisting silver fibers with 100% long staple cotton. Miracle brand linens eliminate bacterial growth while remaining soft and absorbent. Check them out in the link in the description down below. Now, without further ado, please enjoy these true creepy encounters. This will be a short one. My husband and I were on our way home from a road trip, and we were somewhere in Virginia. I don't remember why we decided to get off the highway, but we did. It must have been 2 a.m. We were just off the highway, and the road splits into 4 directions. There was absolutely no light coming from anywhere. There were no cars. It was just complete darkness, except for our own headlights. There were no buildings or houses for anywhere the eye could see, just trees. But then, I see a pair of eyes gleaming towards us. He's cross-legged, setting up straight in the middle of the paved road. Obviously no cars come here. He makes direct eye contact with us and starts to get up. He starts walking towards us on the road. Maybe it's paranoia, but he looked severely pale and skinny. He was barefoot. I know it could have been drugs, but it was such a bizarre location. There was nothing in that area. I panicked and told my husband to turn around. He did a 3-point turn and he got right back on the highway. My husband, who isn't afraid of anybody, won't even talk about this night because of how not right it felt. And to this day, it still freaks him out. This happened around 7 years ago. My older brother and several of his friends went on a camping trip in rural Maine. When they drove up there, they decided to stay in a random motel nearby the skiing trails. He said it looked pretty run down and sketchy, but being college kids at the time, they didn't care much and just wanted a cheap place to sleep for the night. After a nice day of skiing, they got some drinks at a local bar and headed back to the motel to get some rest. As they were all hanging out in their motel room, my brother opened up a desk drawer to store some of his things in, and what he found inside the drawer made his jaw drop in horror. There was a coiled Ethernet cord with dried blood stains all over it. As if this discovery wasn't terrifying enough, about an hour later, all the lights turned off all of a sudden. My brother walked outside and saw that there wasn't a single light on in the motel. He went to the front desk and the guy working there explained that the power had went out. It was nighttime at this point, so everything was completely pitch black. My brother spent the rest of the night awake and scared shitless. The power didn't turn back on until the next morning. My brother took a photo of the bloody Ethernet cord, but sadly, I just texted him asking if he still had the photo, and he cannot find it on his phone or iCloud. I really wish I could have shared the photo here, because it is truly shocking to see. From the looks of it, I can imagine someone was brutally stabbed and strangled in the room that he was staying in. I also think that it's pretty stupid that he didn't call the police or fill out a report about this. My bedroom is the hottest room in the entire house. In the winter, I have to almost fully cover the vent to block heat from coming in, and I have to sleep with the window open a tiny bit to keep it from getting too hot. I have medical issues that cause me to get violently ill if I get overheated. When it's fall, I generally keep the bedroom windows open. They have screens on them, and I have blinds and blackout curtains, so I sleep with them open. I have a window at the front of the house and a window on the side of the house in my bedroom. The other night, I was watching TV because I have horrible insomnia and just couldn't fall asleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my window on the side of the house. There's leaves all over the ground already, so it was pretty loud. I paused my show and listened, honestly just figuring it was one of my roommate's dogs. I realized, unfortunately, that there was no way it was either of his dogs. The girl dog is much younger, maybe a year old, so she prances everywhere. It's pretty adorable and very distinctive since I hear her out there several times a day. His other dog is a large dog, but he's very old, very fat, and slow-moving. He generally can't even walk the distance from the back door to the other side of the house near my window. His walk is also very distinctive because he hardly lifts any of his paws. He's seriously super old. I also noticed that it was very clearly the footsteps of someone walking on 2 feet. Within seconds of me pausing the TV, the steps completely stopped. I listened for a while, but eventually turned the show back on. We do have a tree between us, my window and our neighbor. It's completely plausible that if someone was outside the window, they could have climbed into the tree and waited until they could get away without being heard. Eventually, I just fell back asleep. Just a little while ago, I had dozed off watching TV, only to be woken up by my cat frantically jumping on my head to look on the side window. He never looks out that window when I'm asleep, because he can't find a way to the window without stepping on me and waking me up. His tail was puffed out, and the hairs on his back were slightly raised. I've rarely ever seen him do this. He has only acted like that one time towards an animal, and that was a cat we brought into the room and allowed to eat his food. He looks out the open windows all the time. He loves seeing other animals. This took me from scared to absolutely freaked out. I paused the show again. It was unmistakably human steps outside my window again. Only this time, they didn't stop when I paused the TV, and they definitely weren't trying to be quiet. I heard them take several quick steps, and the sound faded towards the front of the house. It was confirmed when my cat launched himself across the room to look out that window. I heard what sounded like a car door, and then nothing more. I called the police, and 2 of them searched the outside of the house with flashlights, and another car drove around shining their spotlight around the neighborhood. Here's hoping whoever this is doesn't keep coming back. I'm going to get some cameras as soon as I can to put outside my windows so that I can find out who this is and hopefully have them stop. This was just posted on my Nextdoor app. Attempted break-in. 2 nights ago, the Redacted Complex experienced an event where 5 teenagers, for a period of about 10 minutes, stood in our parking lot shouting and screaming, and pressing the security buzzers for each unit in the complex. Police were called, and they left the premises before they arrived. We're not sure of their ages, but would guess around the ages of 13 or 16 years old. All were males except for 1 female. After this incident, no one really thought much of it. It was loud and disruptive, but not threatening. We thought it was just teenagers pranking us, and no harm or damage was caused. It didn't occur to anyone that they would return for a repeat performance, but that's exactly what happened last night. Between the hours of 9 and 10 p.m., the same group returned, and initially began with the same behavior from the previous night. They disturbed every unit by repeatedly pressing the security buzzers for each unit, and then began loudly shouting. This continued for a little while, and then for reasons no one can figure out, their behavior became more aggressive and threatening, and in one case, more bizarre. The shouting and screaming turned to profanity and threats. 2 of the males in the group attempted to force their way into the building and breach the front security door. Once that effort failed, they climbed up the first one, then another front-facing balconies, and tried to force the sliding glass doors open. Those balconies are approximately 6 feet off the ground. One of the units was occupied at the time, and the other was not. While this was going on, the female in the group removed her pants and underwear and stood shouting naked from the waist down. The others were shouting at her and encouraging her while she did this. Once the attempted break-ins failed, they then congregated in a group, continuing to shout and threaten, and then finally they left. They had been told the police had been called, and probably thought that they were running out of time before their arrival. At least 3 residents have cell phone video of some of this. The residents of this complex are, to say the least, very confused. We've never had any issues with any of the neighbors in any of the surrounding communities. Nothing has transpired recently that we can think of that would encourage a group of teens to seek us out for this behavior and target us. At no time did any resident threaten them, other than to calmly ask them to leave, and to tell them that we had called the police. Only one resident reacted angrily and aggressively, and that was when they were facing him and trying to break through his balcony door. This morning, we inspected the exterior of the complex, and our vehicles haven't seen any damage. There are 2 high-back dining room chairs on our side rear parking area. We think it's possible that they came from an unoccupied home that is near us. We have messaged the property owner to have them check the premises. I wanted to post this to alert other neighbors, especially those in the immediate vicinity to our group of buildings. If you are unfamiliar with who or where we are the 4 3-story brick buildings located at the intersection of redacted roads. If this had been a one-off incident, I wouldn't bother posting, and would have assumed it was just a prank. In my mind, this crossed over into a dangerous and threatening activity when the perpetrators attempted a forced break-in. If they decided to do this to us, I have to think that the individual, single-family homes that surrounded us are equally vulnerable. Perhaps more so because we have security doors and systems in place, and the advantage of numbers with at least 60 to 80 residents. For all I know, we have seen the end of this, and I hope that is the case. But if we haven't, and you reside close to us, I strongly encourage you to double-check your door and window locks, and try to be a little more vigilant in the coming days. So I live in a residential area, which has very few people. That's why the area in which I live is not very well known. This is back when I was 10 years old, and it was a usual day, and I was sitting outside my house on the chair, looking at the clouds or something. That's when I did something weird. I began to scream "hey" into the nothingness. I don't know what motivated me to do this, but I kept on doing it until I got a response from the other side of my house. The voice replied back saying hi. I got up from my chair and saw a girl, about my age, just standing there on the sidewalk looking at me. She was wearing a black dress and had straight black hair. We began yelling things back and forth across the street, which now that I think about it, it's pretty weird. Here's where the story gets a little hazy. The thing about 10-year-old me is that I was an incredibly shy and introverted person. I only spoke when I was spoken to, and otherwise, I kept to myself most of the time. But this time, it was like I was a different person. I even managed to invite this girl into my house, which I had never done before. Keep in mind, this was a girl that I have never seen before, which made this even more confusing. I remember my mom also seeing her and inviting her in without any hesitation. I remember we went up to my room, and I clearly remember us reading a book about ladybirds. We drew for a bit, and then she said she was going home because it was getting dark. After she left, my mom laughed and said that she was happy that I made a new friend. After that, I never saw that girl again. I went out and yelled like I did that day, but I never got a response. I was confused, but I didn't let that bother me much. Later, when I asked my mom about it, to my horror, she said, "What girl?" And I told her about the girl who lives across the street. She stared at me for a moment and said, "There is no girl your age across the street. The people who live there are a family of 3 who just had a baby." I never really thought about this story before, but ever since watching many videos on horror stories, it made me think about this supernatural experience. This sounds like it came straight out of a movie. What intrigues me is, what did I do to conjure up this girl? Was it just simply my imagination out of my boredom? Was she a spirit? If so, how did my mom acknowledge her and forget about her the very next day? I guess there are some things that we will never find out. The college I went to was pretty isolated in the middle of nowhere. It took me over an hour to get home each day. There was a lot of small trails and forest areas on and around the campus to walk through though. Me and my 2 friends at the time used to frequently walk down this wooded trail until we got to a little stone bridge going over a canal. We would take the steps and sit under the bridge, usually feeding the ducks. People who lived on the other side typically had boats and such to take down the canal, and I guess this guy was no exception. One day, this man walked past us, seemingly just going under the bridge to continue down the canal. He took a few steps out and then turned around to look at us. He said his name was Indy and started asking us about college and how often we came here. My friend, who was extremely tall and decently threatening if he wants to be, got a little defensive and he asked for our names. He said he had a boat on the river and pointed it out and asked if we could maybe just keep an eye on it whenever we were close by, to make sure that nothing happened to it. My friend agreed and pretended to take the guy's phone number, and he left back the way that he came. This boat looked like it hadn't been used in at least a year. It was filthy and slightly broken. We left soon after this encounter, as we felt creeped out. My friend told everyone to not go back there alone, just in case he was a predator or something. I didn't listen, and went back there to read about a week later. It was peaceful and got me off campus. However, the guy came back. I saw him walking back towards the bridge in the same direction he came from last time. Something in my gut told me to get out of there, so I grabbed my things and basically ran back to college. Since then, we've never seen that old boat or Indy ever again. Part of me wonders what happened to him, but the other is glad that he never came back. Has this happened to anyone? I'm hoping there's a technical explanation, but here it goes. I manage a small team of 4 people. 3 of them were working in the office with me one day when the 4th was working from home. Let's call her Lisa. There was nobody else in the office, so we were the only people on site. We held a team meeting in the conference room and connected with Lisa on Microsoft Teams so she'd be included. My laptop was plugged into a large TV monitor so I could share my screen and audio. Towards the end of the meeting, I asked if anyone had any questions. There was silence in the conference room and silence on Teams. Amidst the silence, we hear a faint voice say, "I don't understand." It sounded like a small child fussing. All eyes in the conference room darted around, although it was clear the sound came from the TV. Lisa has a 5-year-old daughter, so I laughed and said, "Hey Lise, is your daughter trying to join the meeting?" To our surprise, she goes, "My daughter isn't home. She's at school." Stunned, all of us in the conference room exchange glances. Lisa then says, "Wait, that voice didn't come from the conference room?" I explained that the 4 of us were the only ones in the office, and that Lisa was the only one on the team session. We all agreed on the phrase we heard, that it sounded like a young, cranky child. Lisa was home alone and the rest of us were all alone in the office. No other devices were connected to the TV, and nobody had any other devices out during the meeting that would explain the voice. There were no other programs open on my nor Lisa's laptop during the meeting. We were all sober, alert, and oriented. Has anyone else experienced a disembodied voice on a web conference? Maybe hacking or signal interference is to blame? Either way, it was creepy as hell to hear in the middle of the workday. For background, my parents, sister, and I live in an apartment complex for a final week, thank God, that's been in the news recently for numerous health and property violations, and the new owner is being sued by an unlawfully evicted disabled person for stealing his motorized wheelchair. Mice, roaches, ants, and black mold are just some of the issues we had to deal with on our own because they refused to. There's gangs, shootings, murders, break-ins, and vehicle damage. We pay $18.50 for a 2-bedroom with no washer or dryer. In the lease, it states a 24-hour notice before maintenance is allowed to try and enter your house. We've had multiple problems with maintenance, as have others. They often wait until the women, kids, and teens are alone in the house to knock. Today, I was trying to nap due to a severe double ear infection and strong antibiotics. Knocking and ringing of the doorbell woke me up. This was the conversation. "Hi, it's maintenance. We're cleaning the bathroom fans." "Sorry, my parents, the leaseholders, aren't home." "Are you 18 or older? You look like it." "Yes." "Then we can come in." "No, you can't." I close and lock the door, but sit in the living room just in case, because maintenance has keys. My mom came home minutes after and I told her the situation. She said she never got an email or a letter, and she's not comfortable with them being in the house, so I did the right thing. She goes out to get something out of the truck, and thank God she locked up behind her, because they tried to open the door. My mom comes back. "Of course you can clean the fan vent when we're moved out." "Oh," the guy replies. Yesterday, I was driving home from work and was at a stoplight about 5 miles from my work. Coming across the street in front of the car next to me was a younger, maybe late 20s, mid 30s man with forehead tattoos wearing a tailored women's coat with a maroon sweater underneath it. The area has a fair share of homeless people. I didn't think anything of it until he started singling me specifically out, staring right at me as he walked towards my car, then giving me a thumbs up while hunching over and continuing to walk and stare at me. I smiled at him and looked away. He waved his arms, then stood straight up and stopped dead center of my car, staring in at me, wanting some sort of reaction. I didn't give it to him, so he flipped me off and then continued to stare at me while walking away. Honestly, I didn't think anything at all of this interaction. Just some odd dude probably on drugs or homeless or both. Today at work, I work at a funeral home, the doorbell rings, and when I open the door, it was him. Same outfit, soaking wet from rain, 5 miles away from where I saw him yesterday. I instantly got nervous. The conversation went like this. Him: "I want, and I deserve to come in and use your phones." Me: "We're all on a conference call, so I can't help you." Him: "Oh, well, maybe I can come back later." Me: "No, we won't be here. There's a lot of other places with phones across the street." Him: "Well, it's like pulling teeth, and I'm walking on compound fractures." No, he wasn't. Me: "I can't help you. I'm sorry." I went to shut the door. Him: "You listen to me. If I drop dead and I end up here, we will meet again." With the same intense stare that he gave me yesterday. I just replied, "I look forward to it." He walked away and I told my boss about it, and he went around the building to see if he was anywhere nearby. He wasn't. So the rational side of me feels like this was just a big coincidence, that I had 2 run-ins with the same crazy person. But the nervous side of me feels like, how the hell does he know where I work? It really shook me up, and I'm really freaked out. So when I was younger, I was just doing boring schoolwork and stuff until we got an intruder alarm, which doesn't happen often, and we don't even practice it because it was such an uncommon thing to happen. The guy proceeded to walk around the school grounds, even as far as our gym room, and I happened to see him as I was seated near the window. He had a puffy black jacket and a baseball cap. It was all pretty terrifying, considering a thing like this has never happened before. Later that day, I overheard my teachers talking about him, and how when they searched him, they found a kitchen knife in his pocket. Thankfully, no one got hurt, but everyone was just freaked out. The college that I went to was very safe. The worst thing that happened was crazy drunk frat boys getting the police called for mischief. It was your typical campus, fitted with those blue boxes where you can call for an emergency. Now, when I walked around the campus, I'd often scroll through Reddit or Instagram. I know it was stupid, but don't judge me, I was just a college student. Anyway, this particular night, it was dark out, but only 7 p.m. There were lots of other students walking around and the campus was pretty well lit. Yet for some reason, I didn't go on my phone this time. I just had this feeling that something was off. I couldn't place it, but in the back of my head, I felt like something bad was going to happen. The walk continued normally, and by the time I got back to my dorm, I had begun to laugh at myself. Now these were apartment-style dorms that you entered from the outside via a pathway. As I was walking up the pathway, the feeling from before returned, and this time I was hit by a sudden feeling of intense fear, much stronger than before. I looked around the common area and noticed a light coming from my room. Something told me not to investigate, and instead, I muttered, "Seriously, I forgot it?" and went back outside. I felt a bit paranoid for the next 5 minutes, crouching down behind the window like a crazy person. I began to think that I was just being weird when I heard footsteps. I slowly peeked into the window to see a man that I didn't know coming out from my room and pouring himself a glass of soda. He brought it back with him and disappeared again. I stayed there for what felt like forever, until about an hour passed and I heard footsteps again. He was headed for the front door, and I bolted to the stairway. I climbed to the floor above and waited for a few minutes before returning. Sure enough, he was gone, and when I entered my dorm, I no longer had a bad feeling. I checked the place thoroughly and found nothing out of the ordinary until I laid down to go to bed a few hours later and felt something weird under the covers. I jolted up and turned on the lights to find a few condoms wrapped in plastic. I'm not sure what would have happened, but I'm fairly certain that somebody was trying to assault me. I didn't recognize this man from class, but he definitely was about my age. I don't know how he knew me, but the thought that I could have been stalked without realizing it struck me hard. I never saw the man again, and I never got the same feeling on campus. Somehow, I subconsciously knew that something was wrong. I have no clue how, and maybe there's an explanation, but that bad feeling may have saved my life. To the stranger who picked me up at a park. I recently told my longtime partner of this encounter after realizing how lucky I was. Anyway, I remember being at a birthday party being held at a park, and I must have been 4 or 5 years old max, just because of how small I remember being. The tables at the park my family was at sort of sat on the top of the slope, and so, to get down to the playground, you had to walk away. My cousins and I did just that. I then remember a tall, bald, white man picking me up and carrying me away in his arms. I was confused, but didn't know what to do. I then remember my dad turning around from the top of the slope and seeing this happen. He ran down, yelled at the man. He let me go and ran away. Never spoke about it since. I've been meaning to post this here for a while. Wrote my first draft back in April, so it's taken a long time and a lot of therapy for me to be able to think about this experience. I've noticed how many people's stories take place over weeks, months, even years. So I'm here to tell you mine. 12 hours of my life. I managed to block out a lot of memories surrounding this night. But early this year I was mugged, and my PTSD returned, as did a lot of the missing memories of those 12 hours. The first time I'm telling anyone the story of what happened to me. I haven't told my partner, my therapist, my parents. No one knows the details. If there's anything that should be taken away from my story, it's this. Remember, you don't have to be polite to everyone that you meet. The setting. On October of 2018, I was at the age of 18 years old. In my first year at university in a big city in the UK. I had always lived in the countryside before this, so was never very street smart. About a year before I went to uni, I had started a relationship with this guy, Jimmy, my now ex. He's my first real relationship, and I thought the world of him. But it was not reciprocated in a loving and compassionate way. Jimmy started off as a very emotionally abusive and got progressively worse, but that's a whole other story. At this point, Jimmy and I had been together just under a year and had applied to universities in the same city, mostly by coincidence, and we both moved to the same city. I wanted to have a proper student life, so got accommodation in a student block on the other side of the city to him. Jimmy had been using drugs for quite a while. Initially started off just by smoking weed, but this progressed rapidly, and by the time we were at uni, he was regularly doing a lot of hard drugs, plus smoking weed multiple times a day. Honestly, I don't think that he was ever not high. When we moved to university, we still saw each other every couple of days, and he found a regular drug dealer, Mark, that had been using continually since we got there in September. Jimmy used to buy from Mark multiple times a week, so on a handful of occasions, I had briefly met him. Mark lived a lot closer to my student accommodation than to Jimmy's, so a couple of weeks before this all happened, Jimmy had started picking up drugs from Mark when he came to see me. Meaning, Mark would often be outside of my accommodation. Jimmy had asked me a few times if I would pick up the drugs he bought from Mark, but I had always felt weird speaking to Mark on my own. Plus, I rarely smoked weed, so felt very weird picking up drugs in general. We'll start at 6 p.m. One day at the end of October, Jimmy had plans to come and see me that evening, and asked me again if I would pick up some weed from Mark. I was in a good mood that day and feeling more confident than usual, so for the first time, I agreed to. Jimmy gave me Mark's number and said that Mark would message me when he was on his way. Only around 10 minutes later, I got a message from Mark saying that he was nearly outside my apartment and I needed to go outside. So I did. Outside of my accommodation, there was a quieter area with a lot of benches. so I sat and waited for him. Behind me was only a wall and a small contained area that had all of the bins for the building. Out of nowhere, I felt someone's hands on my shoulders in a really weird, creepy way. I jumped, obviously, and then I realized it was Mark, who I barely recognized as I had only briefly seen him a couple of times. I realized now that my back had been to the wall in the bin storage, so he must have been waiting there. I was immediately on guard because of how he touched my shoulders, especially because I didn't know him, so I shifted away from him as he sat down next to me. He began talking to me as if we were buddies, asking me 1,000,001 questions about myself, like deeply personal questions. The whole time I was deflecting, not wanting to give out any information, so started asking him questions instead. He began a really deep monologue about himself and his life, where he openly told me he had just gotten out of prison a few months before. It was for armed something, some kind of violent crime. I engaged his ramblings, just nodding along, but still trying to get back to the whole point of just picking up drugs for my boyfriend. 7 p.m. I have always been able to talk to anyone, and was always taught to be nice when someone is talking, so I ended up sitting there for around an hour trying to get the conversation back to the reason I was there, picking up drugs for my boyfriend, and to go. It was so long it actually started getting dark. This guy just kept talking. I knew my boyfriend was going to be coming over soon, so I kept looking at my phone to see if he was on his way, but he hadn't replied. Eventually, I told Mark that I needed to get back inside, as I was meeting up with my boyfriend soon, and then going clubbing after with some friends, so I needed to get ready, and could I please just pick up the drugs? He then said, "Oh, well, I can't give them to you here. There's CCTV everywhere. We can go inside so that I can give them to you." I had witnessed him giving my boyfriend drugs in this same spot countless times before, so I knew this was bullshit. I didn't want Mark to come back to my apartment, so I told him that he could go into the lobby of my building, where there was a disabled bathroom, and he could give them to me there. He agreed and followed me inside. We went into the bathroom. It was a very large room, so I didn't have to be too close to him. And then he locked the door behind us. He then began fiddling with something in his pocket. I assumed the drugs. But instead, fully pulled down his pants and started peeing in the toilet. I was really freaked out. This guy just presented his package to me and began peeing. But I rationalized that there was no way he had any sexual motive, because he had met me and my boyfriend together, so knew I was in a relationship. I just figured he really had to go. I had kept my eyes shut the whole time, and when he flushed, I thought that finally he would give me the drugs and let me go. He said, "I really want to roll myself a joint, but there's no space in here to do it. Can I come and roll it on your desk and then I'll give you Jimmy's stuff?" I asked again if he could just give it to me now, and he said no, saying that I was being rude for not inviting him in. By this point, I was wanting to get ready to go out with my friends later that evening, and knew my boyfriend would be coming by any minute. So, figured it'd be okay, even though I didn't want this. It's worth noting that I was emotionally abused by my boyfriend, and knew he would be mad at me if I didn't collect his drugs, or if I annoyed Mark because he was his favorite dealer. I honestly figured that Mark was harmless, despite him telling me he was a violent criminal, and just assured myself that he was only a bit creepy. It would be fine. 8 p.m. Reluctantly, I took Mark up to my apartment, opened the door and let him in. I said he had to roll his joint fast because I had to get ready. Finally, he gave me the drugs that my boyfriend wanted, so I felt better at that point. He walked over to my desk, moved all my things to the side and sat down, getting out the things to roll his joint. I can't roll a joint, but I've seen Jimmy do it countless times, so I know that it doesn't take more than a minute or so. Mark keeps trying to talk to me, but at this point my answers were getting shorter and shorter. He rolls this joint so slowly that I cannot even describe it. He then said, "Well, I can't smoke this outside, so is it cool if I just stay here and smoke it? It'll only take 5 minutes to smoke." I said no and told him again that I had to get ready. He replied, "It's okay. You can get ready with me here." By this point, I was over it. I messaged my boyfriend again to tell him to hurry up. Mark asked me again, and in my frustration and wanting this guy out of my apartment, I just said, "Okay, sure, but be quick." I then went out of my room into the shared kitchen. I only had 2 flatmates and no one else was in the apartment that night. Grabbed some wine and a glass so that I could have some solitary pre-drinks, and then I returned to my room. I sat for another 15 minutes being increasingly less polite, but he just kept talking to me. I drank my first glass of wine pretty fast, and just decided if Mark was going to take ages, then I would just get ready to go out with my friends. I told him that as soon as he finished smoking, he could just leave on his own. So I left him at my desk, took some clothes into the bathroom, and jumped into the shower. 9 p.m. Maybe a minute or so into my shower, I heard some soft footsteps outside the door. And like a scene from a freaking horror movie, I saw the door handle slowly be pushed down. Thank fuck that I remembered to lock the door. All of a sudden, Mark began banging on the door. I turned the shower off and just said, hi, through the door. He shouted through the door, asking me to let him in because he needed to pee again. I obviously said no and just got dried and dressed. Thankfully, I took clothes to the bathroom as fast as I could. By this point, I figured there was no way that he was going to leave my apartment until I did. So I did my makeup as fast as I physically could and messaged my friends that I'd be coming to theirs sooner than I had planned. I hadn't gotten a reply from my boyfriend, so I just told him that I was going out early and not to come over. I got ready to go and told Mark that I was leaving now and he needed to come downstairs with me. He was still sitting at my desk and ignored what I was saying. He asked if he could stay in my room while I was out because he was tired and wanted a nap. Finally, I was firm with him, and after a lot of convincing, he left with me. I made sure to order an Uber to my friend's place so that he couldn't try and walk with me, and by the time we got outside, my Uber was nearly there. He stood with me, looking over my shoulder at my phone the whole time. Then the Uber arrived. I got into it and Mark straight up walked around the other side and got in. I was in disbelief and laughed, then told the Uber driver that I didn't know who this guy was, and he wasn't getting in with me. The Uber driver was not as polite as me and told Mark to get out, and he did. 10 p.m. I sat there on the way to my friend's house, and finally felt calm that I had gotten away from Mark. I called my friend from the Uber and told her what happened. So, she said she would come outside to get me with a couple of her flatmates. My friend's accommodation was not far from mine, and took longer to get to by car than on foot because of the one-way system in the city. But I didn't care at this point. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes later I arrived, and my friend came over to my Uber, then brought me back to her group of friends. She had quite a few people with her, and I suddenly noticed that one of her male flatmates was talking to someone slightly away from the group. I looked over and suddenly realized he was talking. Mark. I guess he was looking at the address when I had the Uber app open earlier. I whispered to my friend and she freaked out, and went inside with me straight away. I was super freaked out that this guy wouldn't just leave me alone. He refused to leave my side for the last few hours, and now he had followed me to my friend's house. Honestly, I felt much safer now. I've met a few creeps in my time, so just decided to get over it by having a nice time with my friend. So we sat in her kitchen having a chat and some drinks. 11 p.m. After a while talking to her, I almost forgot what had happened just an hour ago, and was getting increasingly tipsy from the wine. The kitchen door opened and her male flatmate comes inside, announcing that he invited the guy in who had given him free weed. You guessed it. Mark walked in. Mark addressed me by name, and walked over, putting his hands around my waist from behind. I get pretty confident when I drink, so had no problem pushing him off of me and announcing to everyone in a joking way, "Yeah, this is the guy who's been following me around all evening. I don't know him." Even in this room with all of my friend's flatmates, I didn't feel safe. He stayed away from me, looking at me for a while from the other side of the kitchen, and I just ignored him. My friend could tell that I was uncomfortable, so suggested we go and drink in her room. Around 30 minutes after going into her room, the door slams open suddenly, and Mark is standing there. He says, "Oh, I was looking for the bathroom. Can I use yours?" My friend had an ensuite. She tells him to get the fuck out, and he does. I'm honestly just bored of this guy's constant presence at this point, so we decide to just go to the club early. 12 p.m. We grab our stuff, run past the kitchen door and outside. My friend orders us an Uber, and we get in and go to the club. After a while, some of her flatmates join us, but Mark does not. Thank God. I just try and enjoy the night, but being a poor student, I can't afford any more drinks at the club. As I begin to sober up, I realize how shaken up and creeped out the whole evening made me, and I don't feel safe. 2 a.m. After only a couple of hours, I decide that I just want to go home and sleep because this whole experience freaked me the fuck out. I take an Uber back, use my key card to get into my apartment building, go upstairs and into my apartment. I started getting ready for bed, put on some pajamas and started taking off my makeup. All of a sudden, I heard a loud knock on my door. I had no clue who it was, but since it was still early-ish for a Friday night, I thought my boyfriend maybe finally decided to show up. My door didn't have a peephole, so I walked into the door in my PJs, unlocked it planning to open it a tiny bit to see who it was. And then, bam. The door flew open so fast that I was pushed backwards into my apartment and then shoved into my room, which was directly across from the front door. In my panic, I froze, then looked up only to realize that Mark is now standing in my apartment. The realization started to sink in. Mark had just forced his way into my room, and I was trapped there with him. He was visibly angry and very high. He locked the door behind him and began rambling about how I was so rude for not inviting him in with my friends, for ignoring him, for not letting him in the Uber, etc. I was terrified, so ran over to the bed and grabbed my phone. He walked over behind me and began grabbing me, touching me as much as he could, so I shouted at him to get off. He saw my phone in my hand and immediately smiled and told me to open the camera. I was so terrified. So I did as he said, and he said he wanted a picture of us together. I did as I was told and took a selfie with him while he posed with his arms around me and then kissing my cheek and then kissing my neck. He then screamed at me to unlock my phone, so I did. He made me open up my messages and send Jimmy the selfie of me and Mark sat next to each other on my bed, so I did. He waited for it to send and then grabbed my phone and put it down on the desk. He sat at my desk for the next 4 to 5 hours, talking at me continually, saying how I was so rude, I needed someone to teach me some manners, how I had to do what he said because he was older than me, how Jimmy wasn't good enough for me, how I was so beautiful, and how he knew that I needed to be with him. He told me that his girlfriend knew he had been at my house that evening, and now she said he can't go home, and it was all my fault. The whole time I continued bargaining with him, trying to get him to leave, but it didn't work. Occasionally, I would just lie down on my bed or sit and not speak. Every time I did, he would get up and wrap his arms around me, or try and spoon me, stroking my face, trying to kiss me, and trying to take my clothes off and touch me. Every time I fought him off, and he would get angry again, and go and sit at the desk and keep shouting. I knew that this guy had previously been in prison for some kind of violent crime, so I did not want to piss him off. I just sat there for hours and quietly sobbed, too scared of trying to leave because I would have to walk past him to get to the door. I was out of options. I didn't know if I could go out without angering him. I couldn't call the police because he had my phone. My flatmates weren't in, so my screams meant nothing. 6 a.m. While he was sat at my desk, he kept smoking more weed or taking a line of whatever drug, so was becoming more and more out of it. He was becoming more sleepy as he smoked more weed, until I was able to speak between his ramblings, so I gently said I was going to the bathroom. I noticed he had his eyes partially closed and figured I only had one chance, so I took the opportunity and grabbed my phone off of the desk as fast as I could, unlocked the door, and ran out of the apartment. The one thing I will always remember is being in tears, pressing the button for the elevator to come, probably about 50 times because I was so scared that he was going to come after me. As I got into the elevator, I heard him come out of my apartment, shouting my name, but the elevator doors closed just as he looked at me. I was able to get downstairs and out of the building. I ran around the corner of the apartment in my PJs and panically dialed the number for the police, told them what happened and that this guy had been in prison until recently. The next thing I knew, around 5 police cars showed up. I was in such a state and called my boyfriend to tell him what happened. He was still awake and hadn't come to visit the night before because he was with a girl who he says is a friend, and said that now he didn't want to come be with me because he had some weed on him and didn't want to be near the police. I told him to get to my place right now, and he reluctantly did. The aftermath. The police had to force entry to my apartment because Mark had locked himself in and barricaded the door. They arrested him and he ended up going to prison for drug charges, but not for what he did/tried to do to me. The police said they couldn't prosecute him because I had willingly let him into my apartment earlier that night and he hadn't physically done anything. Sexual assault and attempted you-know-what, plus holding me hostage in my own apartment, but okay. After I had given my statements to the police, I went back inside to see that after I had escaped, my room was trashed. Mark had thrown things around and smashed things in anger. I'm so glad I got out when I did, because I can't imagine what would have happened if I was trapped in the crossfire. I don't know what happened to Mark after that, but I moved out of the apartment a couple of months later and away from that city as soon as I could when COVID hit to make sure that Mark could never find me. I actually stayed in my abusive relationship for another year or so until I realized that I was too good to put up with Jimmy's shit. I had so much severe PTSD from the incident that I couldn't go outside for months after, which messed up the whole of my first year at university. It's taken until now for me to be able to walk around at night, and being alone in public is still really difficult. I'm well aware that the ending is very anticlimactic, and I wish that I had been able to advocate for myself, but I just shut down emotionally afterwards. I can't get too much into the details of the sexual assault and attempted you-know-what, because honestly, thinking about it makes me want to throw up. But I realize I was so lucky to be able to fight him off every time, because without a doubt, he wanted to hurt me. After this all happened, I started volunteering with people in prison for crimes like sexual assault and try to prevent them from ever reoffending. I think it's my way of advocating for others, because I couldn't advocate for myself. If you take one thing away from this, it's stop being so polite. I was raised to be nice to everyone, and I realize now that being polite worsened everything. I wish that I had not been polite enough to pick up the drugs from my ex, or polite enough to let Mark in when he begged. My story involves myself and 3 of my really good friends throughout my whole family childhood. We'll have them go by Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy, whom I am good friends with to this day. I could not write this story to you without their help, consent, and experience as well. The story you are about to read is 100% true and not made up in any way. Regardless, whether we had been seeing things or not, the reality is we had experienced something very horrifying the one night at my friend Kevin's cabin. We thought long and hard about whether we should actually share it or not. We were afraid of being ridiculed. But we are ready to share with the community. And again, you had to be there to experience it. One of my friends had actually suffered a nervous breakdown after the incident and needed counseling himself. Also, I would like you to know that I've always been a skeptic on the paranormal, and find it very hard to believe in many aspects. But I love to watch, listen, and read on it, simply because I love to have an open mind in life. An open mind, in my opinion, is a growing one. Whether it was paranormal or not, someone was clearly there that night. Now, on to the story. During the midsummer, usually around the middle of July, me and a couple of my good friends, who I had already mentioned, all the way through my childhood, always made time to go up to my one friend's family cabin, way up north in the forest of Minnesota, located on Vermilion Lake. Throughout all of our young years, we would always go, for sure accompanied by my friend's dad. It was Kevin's dad who owned the cabin, and sometimes a few of our dads as well. Once we were juniors in high school, we felt mature and old enough to go to the cabin on our own finally, without Kevin's dad or any other adult supervision that may have accompanied us. I would like to mention a little information in regards to my friend's cabin to help you picture this scenario. My friend's cabin is very remote, and very little based upon a very large-sized island. Other cabins were on the island, but the next one closest to us was a solid 1.5 mile away, which you could get to by taking a man-made path around the island. And I want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of the cabin, as his cabin was on an island, and take his boat across the lake about 1/2 mile to reach the cabin. My mind always had a tendency to run around when sleeping there at night throughout all of my years, for it was all one level with only 2 bedrooms next to one another. There was a kitchen/living room connected to a bathroom in the back of the cabin, and where you slept in the cabin, there were always at least one window in each room with no curtain to it at all. So it was very easy to see outside the woods and lake, and this is where my mind would run, as I always thought someone was peering in. Of course, nobody ever was. I had been to this cabin a dozen times throughout my lifespan, and nothing ever happened, and the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now for the scary part. Usually we would stay a week's worth or 4 or 5 nights. On the 3rd night during the trip, when we were there on our own, we had set up a campfire and had been drinking beer all night. I don't condone underage drinking, by the way. We just happened to sneak some, being the rebels that we were. We went out to this dock to gaze up at the magnificence of the stars and enjoy our buzz when all of a sudden we heard something out at the water that kind of sounded like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked out at the lake with curiosity, wondering where the splash came from. Having our poles ready 24/7. Thankfully, the moon was out that night, which helped light up the lake. Otherwise, it would be dark as black, with there being no city lights for miles upon miles, and we would not have been able to see anything on the lake. My one friend, Ryan, began to point out, saying, what the hell is that? After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, I can only describe it as it was something that simply looked like a head out in the middle of the lake, just floating about, staring at us directly. It was about 3/4 of a football field length out in the lake from the dock. There was no question that I could see its features. It had long black hair and very palish skin like a face, but I couldn't make out the eyes, mouth, nose, or chin. It was as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair all over it. I'll never forget the feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck, and arm all stood up, and I was paralyzed on the inside, ready to leave that very moment. But we told ourselves it was just a loon, as these birds are very popular night drifters on the lake, and they do their hunting late. And also have black and white collars on their coats, and hunt by diving deep into the water, holding their breath for up to minutes. So, it was possible that a loon all of a sudden appeared in the water after hunting for a bit. Or at least, we tried to talk ourselves into that scenario. all of us having the creeps and noticing that it wasn't moving one bit, just treading water in its same place. We all went back to our campfire, lit it even brighter, and headed inside to drink some more. I would like to mention that there was a staircase outside my friend's cabin, around 8 stairs in length down to the bottom where the fire pit was, and the dock. We forgot to mention about the head with the help of the beer, until I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the one inside was preoccupied. I just went outside to do my business, since we were in the great outdoors. When I had been taking a pee and glancing out at the beautiful moonlit lake, I noticed that the black circle object was still there, but this time, it was about 30 yards closer, still looking as if it was staring right at me. I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. Again, it was very pale, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went inside, told my other friends to come look quick, keeping my eyes glued to it at the other end of the cabin. We came outside to see if it was still there looking at us, as if this head was corked up at us, with its chin in the air. Nobody dared go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, ruling out that it probably wasn't a loon, because a loon wouldn't have to tread water in the same spot. Eventually, the current would have drifted it off somewhere else in a rocking manner. For a loon to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck instead. There was no ripple effect at all in the lake from that object. We said it was just a log and went back in. I could tell that everyone else felt uneasy too. A few hours would pass. It was super late into the night at this point, and we knew we needed to sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside once more, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, thinking the log must have floated off or just hit ashore somewhere. As we slept with the windows open that night, there was no AC in the cabin, and we had to move them or we would fry his cabin with it being in the middle of summer. Me and my other buddy, Tommy, slept in the living room, while my 2 other friends slept in the 2 separate bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes peeled shut, I began to hear someone walking around at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin, around the campfire and at the bottom of the stairs. I thought I was about to shit bricks. No question what or whoever I heard down there was on the dock now, pacing back and forth as it made the sound of a boot clicking on the wood. It was as if they were sure what to do with themselves. It lasted about 3 minutes. Wanting to whisper to my buddy, but frozen in fear, I just kept my eyes shut and ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 steps up the deck stairs all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting out down the main path instead. After it sounded like the steps were long gone and a couple of minutes had passed, I woke up Tommy, asking if he heard the steps, both of us setting up. I was startled to my friend Ryan walking out of his room and saying we need to leave a minute after the steps vanished. He must have heard us talking, so felt that he could come out as well. But either way, he was waking us up regardless. Something was very disturbing about his expression, and I asked him why. He woke up my other friend, Kevin, in the other room and said, "Let's go. Get to the boat. It's time to go." Asking him, he explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff, and I will never forget what he explained, and neither will my other friends. He said, when he was turning sides on his bed to get more comfortable, he saw someone peeking in at the top right corner of his window, and it quickly shifted out of his view. He said all he saw was a singular eye, ghostly white skin, and black hair down the window. Again, another thing I would like to add. When we look back at what we experienced, it chills us to the bone realizing that since this face was in the top right corner of the window in my friend's room that he was sleeping in, this thing was either damn near 8 feet tall, standing on something like bricks trying to peek in, or was floating. Ryan then continued to say, "Let's fucking go," very seriously, absolutely disturbed the fuck out of my mind and feeling like it was gonna be sick. And then telling them what my friend and I heard in the living room, we all agreed and packed up our stuff and booked it, not cleaning the cabin or anything. We locked up, and as we headed down the stairs, we saw bare footprints in the dirt heading off into the path and all around the cabin. We picked up our step getting into the boat, threw our stuff onto the boat, untied it, and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water anymore, or to look in the water, thank God. My eyes were just glued to the island, trying to spot anything moving, but I saw nothing. When we had finally gotten our stuff packed in the car and boat tied up, we hopped in the car and took off. We had been driving about 10 miles, and out of the blue, Ryan, who said he saw the person outside of his window, all of a sudden broke down in the car, sobbing, saying, "What was it, guys? Oh, fuck. What did I see?" We called to tell our parents what had happened on the way back, and that Ryan was freaking out, and they told us to get home safely and quickly. It was late, about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept. It was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad went up that following weekend and said that he experienced nothing while there, but did mention bare footprints were still lingering, which he thought was odd, because someone was walking around his property, which bugged him badly. Whatever my one friend saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping multiple nights. He ended up having to seek some help for a couple of weeks and hop on some sleeping medication. As time went on, he ended up being fine. I, to this day, cannot explain what happened and why it seemed to scare us, and cannot explain what I saw in the lake and what Ryan specifically saw. Nothing has ever happened at that cabin since that night, so we're told from my friend's dad who owns it. I personally have never decided to go back to the cabin, which really makes me sad, because I had a great childhood memory there. Tommy and Kevin both have gone back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to go back, and I'm with him. A lot of people have cabins on this island, so it could have been a prank in the making that had been busted when Ryan saw the person at the window, or the person possibly wanting to do something worse. I will never be able to explain what was floating in that lake, but the fact that this incident, along with bare feet and someone looking in at Ryan all night, all happened in the same night, to me, seems like more than a coincidence. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say that I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave to me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and on one side a very large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick Indiana Jones-style jungle the neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly. Well, most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as everyone else actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery that I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built, many of them built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, and incense are some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into the hill, opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered up with these crypts, and spider webbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes, and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some of the other young kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils, monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill them. The fear was the product of wartime propaganda, used to encourage young men to military service, and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran, and with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness that I started to cry. The sun was setting, and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember so that we never go back. She then went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize that she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. They say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared. The cemetery drowned in inky blackness. The main path dotted with dim, broken lights, feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, looking for her kids, You can hear her crying." And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure. At first, a bright white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side, like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying, softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. That is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many people don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her, too. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery again. Not once. And I never sat back there with Mama-san ever again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now out of respect. I cried the whole time that we were there. I prayed for all of the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back, to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. My dead sister ratted me out to my man. Literally. It's like the title says. My older sister passed away at 5 years old. It was a year before I came along. My man is super connected to her to this day. I have quite a few stories from her that I could share. This one makes me laugh now, though. In my 20s, I start smoking. My ma'am is very anti-drugs, so I only smoked when she was away. A few days later, after returning from a night away, she cornered me in the kitchen and told me that she had a dream about Tina, my big sister. Tina told her that I was smoking wacky backy. Yeah, that's what she called it, in this dream, and she wanted to ask me if it was true. I convinced her it was just a weird dream, and absolutely was not. Sorry, and we moved on. 3 days later, my ma'am came bursting into my room at 4 a.m., shouting at me that I was lying to her. Tina had come back to her and told her I was lying, and that I am. I had to get up for work at 5, so I got up and made tea because she was really angry. So I confessed all. And she went back to bed, annoyed at me for making her doubt my sister more so than the smoking. So yeah, my dead sister is a narc. In 2013, my wife and I divorced, and we both moved into separate homes. The divorce went well, and we are still good friends to this day, partly because we have a daughter together. We agreed to split custody over our daughter, and I rented an old house in a historic district in the city where we live. It was a very pretty home, built in 1935, but kept up very well. I would have my daughter 2 weeks at a time, and she had a bedroom in the back of the house. She was 3 years old at the time, and I kept noticing her talking to her friend. One day, I found her in a little closet talking to someone, and I remember her saying that she was talking to another little girl named Betty. I have no idea where she heard the name Betty, as she was only 3 years old, but I just chalked it all up to a child's vivid imagination. Keep in mind, I am a single dad to a little girl. I really have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to dressing, hair, or just little girl stuff in general. Her mother is good with that stuff, but I'm not. I put my daughter to bed one night after her bath. I remember brushing her hair that night, but that was all I did. The very next morning, her mom came to pick her up from my house, and my daughter was just waking up. Her mom went back to her bedroom to find my daughter's hair was fixed in 2 perfect French braids. Her mom was real proud of me at first, that I had done her hair so cute, but I told her that I didn't and couldn't do that. I can't even braid hair, much less do perfect French braids. We asked our daughter how her hair got fixed, and she told us that Betty had done it during the night. I broke the contract on the rental agreement and moved out within the next month. My grandma's house has always, for as long as I can remember, been a scary place. My dad and aunt and uncle all grew up in the house and had paranormal experiences occur throughout their lives. One example was when my dad and uncle were teenagers. My uncle was walking down the steps and was swinging a towel, as he had just washed his hair. Out of nowhere, my dad, who was standing in the living room at the bottom of the stairs, saw the towel straighten out in front of my uncle, as if someone pulled it, and my uncle fell forcibly down the stairs. Now, my grandma hates all things paranormal, especially Ouija boards, and she would often visit gypsies. So, it is a big no-no in our family to discuss the paranormal events that occur in her house. 20 years ago or so, my cousins and brothers were playing in the upstairs bedrooms of my grandparents' house. The toys were set up in the room across the hall from them, and they were all in the same bedroom playing a board game. Out of nowhere, a Hot Wheels car, no batteries, no wind-up, just an average Hot Wheels car, slowly exited the room that the toys were in, went across the hall and into the room where they were all sitting. Needless to say, they were all terrified. Around 8 years ago, my oldest brother moved into the basement of their house. One night when he was home alone, he woke up out of a deep sleep, having felt like he was shaken by someone. He stood up and instantly smelt gas. He went upstairs and outside of the house. Later, he found out that there was a carbon monoxide leak, and if he had not woken up, there's a big chance he could have died in his sleep. Months after that, when my grandparents were away for the weekend, the family decided to try the Ghost Radar app in their house. We all sat around the phone, and my uncle asked the normal questions. Is anyone here? Blah, blah. Then he asked, who used to live in the basement? At this point, my brother had moved out. The Ghost Radar replied with my brother's full first name, which no one ever calls him. We were shocked. So my uncle asked, how did you save my brother? It replied with, wake. He then asked, what did you save him from? And it said, gas. Needless to say, we were shocked. The last thing that I'm going to talk about that happens in that house is my grandparents' friend's obituary, who passed away probably 15 years ago, will show up in their kitchen every month or so. They usually say hello to their friend and put the obituary back in the basement where it is supposed to stay. A little while later, it'll show back up in the kitchen again. And that's not all of the stories. This post was just too long already. I worked as a PSW on the night shift at a long-term care home. I had a resident bell ring at 2:59 a.m. I went in and asked her what she needed. She proceeded to yell at me that there was a man in her bathroom and I needed to get him out. We had people who would wander into others' rooms. So I asked her what the man looked like, and she said he was a black figure and he had no face. I calmed her down and then told her whoever was in the bathroom that they'd have to leave her alone. I then went back to my charting. Around 3:10, I had another call bell ring out from the other side of the floor. I went into this resident's room. This particular resident would ask for pain meds around this time, and I asked if he needed meds. He told me, and I quote, "There's a creepy man in my room with no face. You need to get him out." My blood ran cold, and I had a nurse stay with me on the floor for the rest of my shift. I do have more stories if anyone wants to hear them. This is actually my stepmom's and her best friend's story. I have my own, but I'm so hesitant to drag some of them up. I'm hoping telling someone else's will open me to it a little more. My stepmom didn't like us much, but she told my sister and I this experience growing up to scare us out of being stupid. It was my family's stranger danger story. My stepmom, we're going to call her Macy, grew up as a kid of a privileged teen in the 70s, and her mom had moved their family over here, the States, from England, when she was about 9. She went to a pretty nice high school in a really nice town. There she made friends with a girl, Lily, who didn't exactly run with Macy's type of crowd. Popular, stereotypical, etc. They really hit it off, and Lily would take Macy out to do her type of stuff. Hiking, fishing, sailing, and camping. Anyways, because of Lily's influence, the two of them would do stuff like that a good amount. One Sunday, they decided to go hike in some hills about an hour away. Macy put on what I assume were her very expensive hiking boots, and the two of them drove off into the hiking trails. Lily parked in this big clearing with makeshift parking spots. You know, like a piece of wood marking the head of a space. There were no cars there. This was only important in hindsight. They started hiking up the hill, off the path because Lily fancied herself as something of a badass. The hike was nothing extraordinary. If you asked my stepmom, she would just lament for 15 minutes how sticky and buggy it was. Anyways, they reached the top of the hill, and my stepmom was done. The polished, pampered side of her was coming out, and she groaned until Lily begrudgingly said okay. They would rest and then walk down again, slower. They had been heading down the hill for maybe 15 minutes when Macy started bitching again. Lily conceded to walking down the side of the road instead of the rough hiking trail. So there they are, probably looking like a couple of tools geared up for hiking and walking down a crappy road. And after not even 5 minutes, a truck pulled up next to them. It was red and rusty, and just generally looked like a clunker. The guy driving rolled down the window, and the girls looked in through the passenger side window. He had a big beard, a baseball cap pulled down, and long brown hair. He greeted them and even smiled through his beard, asking if they needed a ride. Macy described him as charming, and even cute. Lily still says the moment he greeted them, her hackles went up. Despite her better judgment, my stepmom convinced her to get in the truck. It must only be a 10-minute drive down to the car, tops. The two girls opened the passenger door to this rusty old thing, when the guy directed them behind the seat to get in the back. They settled in, and the truck started rumbling forwards. Lily always says that was the point it hit her. What a mistake that they had just made. The back seat was clean enough, but there was a rope on the floor behind the driver's seat, and 4 boxes of saran wrap, half hanging out from under the passenger seat. It seemed creepy and weird, but Lily didn't want to freak out my stepmom, so she just kept her mouth shut. After 10 minutes, the woods didn't look any clearer, and they hadn't seen another car the whole time. Lily asked how long he thought it would be. He said he was taking a different route down the hill and had to stop somewhere to get something first. That was it. The girls were 16 and 17 years old, and Lily didn't want to press the issue. She was scared. She could remember his hair because she was sitting behind him. He looked like a woodsy kind of guy, but his hair was super tangled and dirty. She noticed crusted mud on his collar and tried to find something identifiable about him, but just got scared the more she picked up on the little details. He was youngish, strong-looking, and had about a foot on both of them. So they didn't ask any more questions, and he didn't offer any information, and they drove on. Lily tried to talk to my stepmom about how she was incredibly uncomfortable, but she mostly just dismissed it. Lily started begging, increasingly freaked out, and finally putting her foot down, demanding Macy exited the truck with her. So they got out and walked around the front of the vehicle. The house was about 50 yards in front of them. Why this guy would have left two young girls in the truck alone while going into the house is beyond me. And they wandered around, looking at it hesitantly. If this guy really was decent and just trying to give them a ride, it would be super rude to just run off, right? My stepmom had this strict upbringing when it came to manners and a public persona, and she saw it as an issue of that nature. So she actually started to head back to the truck, opening the front door to climb behind the driver's seat. Lily was pissed off and followed her to yell some more. On the driver's side floor, half hidden under the seat, there was a big hatchet. It had dried red and brown stains covering the blade, and it was stuck to the floor. Lily understandably lost her shit, and seeing it, my stepmom started getting hysterical. They decided that leaving was by far their best option at this point, and just booked it off the side of the property into the trees. They bumbled around in the trees for a while until Lily was fairly confident they were on their way back down the hill. My stepmom cried all the way down. Lily felt bad about it, but was also completely freaked out that he would hear it, and kept trying to calm her down. When they finally got back down to the bottom and saw the old wooden fence that surrounded the original parking area, they were relieved. But as they got closer, they saw it. The truck. It was parked on the other side of the Gravely makeshift lot, just sitting there, facing the other way innocently. They couldn't see if anyone was in it, and of course Macy wanted to run for the car, but Lily was super hesitant. She managed to calm my stepmom down, saying she wanted to wait before running out into the open, to see what was out there. Remember, this is the 70s. No cell phones. There was no ranger station or anyone around. The parking lot was big and empty and open, and who knows what would have happened if they decided to stroll across it. Thankfully, Lily convinced my stepmom to chill, and the two of them just hunkered down against a big tree, hidden by bushes and other trees, and waited it out for what was seemed to be a couple of hours, when dark started to fall. All of the animals started coming out and making noises, and my stepmom predictably started getting antsy and bothering Lily, who was tired and moments away from giving in. She was just planning their dash to the car when they heard a clunk across the twilight-lit lot. They watched as one of the back doors of their car swung open, and the bearded guy slid his way out of the back seat. He got out, shut the door, looked around at the surrounding woods for a few moments, and then walked back to his truck. The truck lumbered past their car and out of sight. Several minutes after watching him drive by, they sprinted to their car as fast as they could, jumped in, and peeled out before they even had the door shut. I am Puerto Rican, and I live in Brooklyn. But when I was young, I often spent summers in my grandmother's house in Yauco, Puerto Rico. She had a lot of land deep in the mountains, so deep that roads would go off into the wilderness through narrow mountain spaces, where cliffs were just a few inches off the tire driving in pitch black. If a car came back in the opposite direction, Either they or you would have to drive in reverse until you found a place to pass each other. It was scary. The property has been with my family for a long time, and my family has been in Yauco for as far back as anyone can recall. I used to spend a lot of time with my great-grandfather, Papito, who farmed the land and took care of some cows. He was very old. He was nearly 100% Taino indigenous Puerto Rican. From him, I would hear stories about the Indios who lived in the wilderness when he was young, who were not culturally assimilated into colonial society after hundreds of years of Spanish occupation. My family would often hide and harbor the culturally wild Puerto Ricans, because if Spanish locals found them, los matan, they would kill them. I had my first brush with mortality there, at age 6, crushing the jelly bean-sized eggs of salamanders I found in the bush and watching the pink, underdeveloped hatchling run for cover on instinct. My grandmother told me that what I had done was wrong, and I instantly knew why. I was filled with cold shame and I cried. Papito told me about strange flying discs he would see coming to the mountains and submerging in the lake. He told me about the spirits in the valley, that you could hear them, and to be careful walking around the roads of the mountains at night on my way home from his house to my grandmother's. He taught me how to control a bull with its horns and how to ride it. He did a whistle that only he could do when he wanted to gain the attention of an animal on the mountain that made them either follow him or go where he directed them or just settle them down. He told me about the legend of Diego Salcedo, which took place here in Yauco. When he was almost 100, Papito was dying, and all of our family came to see him. He was a link to an old time, and so many people in Yauco knew him. They all went to his house, uncles, aunts, cousins, people from nearby, all gathered at his house on the top of the hill. I was too young to be present for his passing. I sort of didn't understand what was going on at the time. I was sent down to my grandmother's house to wait for the proceedings to be over. The sun was going down. The mountains were like shadows rising around me. Walking alone, I started to hear animals all about, crying out. Wild dogs all over the mountain. Chickens making a ruckus. The pigs in the lower valley were screaming almost like humans. The cows were howling in a way that I can only describe as similar to Cat Stark from Game of Thrones when Robb died. Every single non-human being in the mountain within earshot was wailing in a fashion that I have never heard before, nor since. As a little kid, you can imagine how frightening that was, especially because I was alone. I hid in the house, looking out the window, waiting for my grandmother, listening to the animals cry. I was especially sensitive to sound back then, as it had been a time in my life where I was often sick and constantly on amoxicillin, which I was allergic to. It created this sort of overwhelming extrasensory sound experience. At some point, all the animals stopped making noise, and I was thankful. Before bed, I asked my grandmother what happened, why all of the animals were making that sound. She told me that Papito had just died, and that all the animals on the mountain had realized the powerful being that protected it for so long was gone. They had seen his spirit pass, and it was sensible that this change would affect them very deeply. My grandmother's perspective was that it was just that animals just know these things. I couldn't sleep. I went outside late at night, curious and scared out of my wits, thinking about the spirits that may be in the darkness of the mountain wilderness, thinking about that terrible, painful lamentation that was embodied by those animals crying like people. I went close to the edge of one of the nearby cliffs that hung over in endless darkness, and I squatted and listened. I heard a sound that scared me, a feral yell in the darkness. I don't know what dog it was, or if it was a dog at all, but it was certainly too close and I was by myself. It howled and yelped, and I regretted coming outside. I was sort of frozen there, afraid to move, but also afraid to stay. I wouldn't dare call out for my grandmother. I would be scolded for coming out and wandering around at night. She probably wouldn't hear me anyway. A moment later,
I heard that whistle that Papito used to do, out in the darkness. The howling stopped. As a child, I didn't think, that couldn't be Papito, he's dead, like any adult in their right mind might. I thought, it's Papito. It had to be. No one else could do that. No one knew how to whistle that way in my family, and it was only us for miles around on the mountain. Where the sound came from, it would be impossible for any person to be, not even during the daytime. It was deep inside the wilderness on every cliffside, but I knew he was there, as I am sure that at the age the line between life and death was blurred. Yauco is the area where Agubanya, the chief of the Taino, lived. It was also where the rebellion began against the Spanish, with the drowning of the conquistador Diego Salcedo. Many of the surviving Taino escaped into the mountains of Yauco and lived in secrecy there for a long time, hiding their lifestyle behind some of the more assimilated natives, like Papito. They say that the Taino are extinct. That cannot be. I knew some of them, and I am one, even if only a little bit.
This is a story that I've told to very few people because I knew that no one would believe me. When I was 6 years old, my mother worked as a cleaning lady for a dying old woman who was a bit scary. She had hired 2 cleaning women, so my mother worked with another woman who also had a son. I got along relatively well with this other child. However, he was sometimes quite strange. In fact, the old woman really didn't like children, and I remember her asking us to be good. Otherwise, she would call a monster, who was obviously a simple model in his balcony, but the other child seemed completely terrified, and I remember that I spent a lot of time picking on him and calling him a sissy. He told me weird stories, like the appearance of a monster at night. They were classic kid stories. It was then that one day, the dying old woman told our mothers that she no longer wanted us to come because we were rather turbulent. My mother was initially annoyed, but decided instead to call on the son of a friend of hers, who was unemployed to look after us. This is where the strange stories begin. This guy who watched us was called Karim. He was between 18 and 20, but I remember him as a guy who traumatized me. His goal was clearly to scare us. However, he didn't do it the classic way. In fact, he was doing terrifying things that even today I couldn't explain. First of all, he often told us about a dog, which he said was very naughty. I remember that the other children wanted to see it at all costs, so one day, after our mothers left, leaving us in the care of Karim, he asked us to go to the kitchen. I remember being very hesitant to follow him, but they called me a coward and I ended up following them anyways. That's when he opened the fridge. However, we were in a blind spot, so as not to see inside. I heard a very strange noise, like something eating. Then he took out his bloody hands. Today, I think it's perfectly explainable. It was just a bad joke. I was just a gullible kid. So Karim was that kind of person. And when I told my mother all this, she just seemed to ignore it all. It was then that one evening, my mother invited the mother of the other child and Karim to my house. That night, I had planned with the other child not to sleep. So we decided to disturb our mothers and Karim. We made noise, we fired projectiles with toy guns, and that's where I saw him. A super tall man came from the corridor and looked at us in our room. We shouted, and then the man ran and disappeared. My mother heard us and had come to reassure us. We ended up sleeping in my mother's room that night. There was a closet in the hallway, and I don't know why, I had always linked this closet to that strange man. Anyway, even today I don't really know what happened. It was surely just a joke by Karim. But how is it possible? Karim was in the living room with our mothers, and above all, only me and the other child had seen this thing. I dare not especially tell this story in general,
It seems too far-fetched and false. However, I know what I saw. It wasn't a dream or anything. It was real, since I had seen the same thing with the boy, and my mother had reassured me that night. I would like to have your opinion on this story. Tell me what you think, and help me to lend less importance to this thing that happened to me. Also, I don't think that it was a paranormal thing or anything like that, and that's why I'm posting it here. This man was probably real, but I absolutely don't know what the hell he was. This happened last night around 7:30 p.m., so it was already dark outside. My friend and I, both 22-year-old females, were about 2/3 of the way through our 16-hour drive back home from Salem, Massachusetts. I really needed a pee, so we stopped at a rest area in eastern Pennsylvania. I usually avoid rest areas, but it looked nice enough and I didn't have any bad feelings about it. We walked in and the only person inside was an older man, probably mid to late 60s, standing by the vending machines talking on his phone. We went past him across the room and into the bathroom. We were in there for a good 10 to 15 minutes because she wanted to pop a couple pimples. When we were finished, we walked back out laughing at something one of us had said. The man was still standing there, but he wasn't on his phone anymore. He stared and smiled at us, in what we both thought was a creepy way, the entire time it took us to get to the door to exit the rest area. We started running back to my car, which was about 6 parking spaces from the door, still laughing, but also a little freaked out. We were about to get in the car when I remembered my boyfriend wanted us to check my oil on the way home, since it was such a long drive and my car had been having some slight issues. I considered waiting until the next time we needed to stop for gas, but we just decided to get it over with. As I was checking the oil, the man from before, along with another slightly younger man that we hadn't seen, left the rest area. They both started walking towards us, with the younger one coming head-on from the sidewalk, and the older one kind of going diagonally towards the driver's side of the car. This was odd, because there were no other cars past mine. The only cars that I could see were on the other side of the lot closer to the building. My friend and I looked at each other and bolted for the car doors, but then I realized I was still holding the dipstick, so I cursed and we had to run back over and lift the hood back up. Then we hurried into the car and locked the doors just as they were approaching. We watched as the younger man walked slowly past the car, staring in at us with a blank face. He continued walking down the sidewalk for a while before pausing for a second and turning around to come back towards us. The older man, still just smiling, got within a few feet of the driver's side door, then turned and walked past us to the other side of the parking lot. I backed out, and once I straightened the car and started pulling forward to leave the rest area, we saw that he had moved to the middle of the road and was standing there with that same unnerving smile. But now, he was motioning for us to stop. I drove past him because no way. We watched in the mirrors as both men got into cars on the other side of the parking lot closer to the building. We spent the next couple of hours shaken up and blabbing about what could have happened. I'm not sure what their intentions were, but there can't really be any good reason to approach 2 women like that at a rest area. I tried telling myself maybe they were going to ask if I needed help with my car troubles, but I was very clearly just checking the oil, and it doesn't make sense why the younger man would walk the complete opposite direction from his car and go so far down the sidewalk. So really, I'm just not sure. This just happened to me this past Friday night. I'm a 30-year-old female, and I work at a bar on the weekends, about a mile from my house. In nice weather, I like to walk the commute. It's a quiet residential area.
The halfway point between my house and work is a park with a basketball court and an adjacent baseball field. I usually don't walk both to and from work in the same day. I'll take an Uber at least one way. The times and days that I walk home vary as well. I left work around 12:30 a.m. About 2 blocks away, I heard someone walking behind me. At first, I thought it was one of the guys that I work with. We've crossed paths on the walk home before since we're somewhat neighbors. But no, it was a young guy, maybe my age at the most. He's on the other side of the street about a block behind me. He starts singing. At first, I think, okay, no big deal. Maybe he wants to make sure he doesn't sneak up on me. But the singing gets kind of eerie. It was starting to make the hair on the back of my neck raise up. I start to pay attention and try to hear clues of mental instability or any direct communication to me. I'm about a block from the sports field when he's getting closer, maybe 30 to 40 feet away. I realize the houses past the fields are kind of unkempt. I've never seen anyone outside, even during the day. So that means that I would have no one to help me out if I needed it. I decide it's getting too creepy, and I abruptly turn around to start walking the way that I came from. He keeps walking his same direction, but I don't look back more than once to confirm his direction. I wait on a corner for about 2 to 3 minutes, debating on if I should call an Uber, return to the bar, or keep walking. I've already texted a coworker who is still at the bar that I'm being followed, sketched out, and to be worried if I don't send him a text upon my arrival home. Like any good horror movie, I stubbornly decide to keep walking home along my original route. The Uber is 7 minutes away, $10 in all for a half-mile trip. Plus, I'd be a sitting duck waiting for it. I don't want to walk the half mile back to the bar when my house is the same distance. I'm ultimately and finally swayed by the fact that I'd had a rough shift and the walk always unwinds me. It was a dumb choice, clearly the wrong choice, but that's how I got to it. As I soldier on, I turn onto the street with the basketball court/baseball field. In the parking lot is a tiny compact car, the kind referred to as a clown car. It's pulling out of the lot, but a car is approaching, so it's waiting directly in my path. I slow down. My gut is saying don't get too close. Eventually it pulls out and turns in the direction that I'm headed, but it goes straight instead of turning where I'll be heading. I sigh the sigh of relief. I notice a sharp smell as I pass the parking lot, almost like dry leaves, earthy but unidentifiable. I chalk it up to my subconscious being on high alert. I turn onto the upcoming street, which is the final stretch of dark residential area before I reach the almost home, safer leg of the trip. I trip over the curb, chide myself for looking vulnerable for even a moment, then pause to regain my composure. There's a U-Haul truck parked about 100 feet in front of me on the opposite side of the street. I look up and see 2 figures coming out from behind the truck. They are identical, all black outfits, weird black pilgrim-esque hats, and what I originally thought were clown masks. My first thought is, oh, I'm screwed. I think of the weird clown thing that happened to me a few years ago. After a moment, I realize the masks are all white, so either Michael Myers or hockey masks. This is somehow a relief, because clowns would have had me so terrified that I'd freeze. Something about the way they're moving is extra eerie. Outfits aside, my body is screaming, get out of there. Without speaking to each other or me, they start walking diagonally across the street towards me. They never stop or turn to communicate with each other. I immediately do a 180 and start power walking. I am already holding my phone as a precaution from the first singing guy, so I FaceTime my roommate. She doesn't pick up. I call the cook that I thought the first guy was. He picks up the second I ring. I say, "Where are you? I need help. I'm being followed. I'm not okay," etc., in a panic. He's climbing in his car. He'll be there in 2 minutes. For some reason, we hang up. I'm now by the fields, and I realize they're again crossing a street to come in my direction. I call him back and tell him to stay on the line because I'm not okay. I had to be obvious to them that I was terrified. The abrupt change of direction, phone calls, looking over my shoulder. I'm on high alert, yet also still doubting myself somehow. The park is a great place to smoke. It's Halloween, etc. I turn into my street where the singer was following me and pause.
The house on the corner of my park is my number one pick if I end up banging on a door for help. They're always outside working on their cars. The property is well maintained, and their windows are within 10 feet of the sidewalk. It gives off Good Samaritan vibes, a stark contrast to the surrounding houses that I've never seen anyone outside of. My friend pulls up to the corner within 2 minutes of my first call. A miracle. I run and hop in. Tears start to slow from the adrenaline release. We start driving back along my original path, and they're still there, standing in the basketball court's parking lot, masks still on, not moving, not lighting something, nothing, just seemingly waiting for me. They watch us drive away. I get home, locked my door, and did my best to calm down before going to bed. I obviously don't sleep very well that night. I call my dad the next day to share my story. He thought the first guy could have been a scout, and the sharp smell could have been ether. He insists that I talk to the police. I work again that night, but slightly traumatized, I get a ride in. I can't bear to walk that path, even in broad daylight. I stop at the police station after work and give them a play-by-play, but only of the two masked creeps. The first singing guy seems like a stretch to connect to them, as the cops are looking slightly skeptical anyways. The one asking me for details finally turns to the officer next to him and asks him to start his patrol at the park that night. They were polite but unfazed. They didn't take my name or anything. The last creepy bit was finally heading home that night. It was exactly the same time, 12:30. A friend was giving me a ride, and we decided to take the same route and see if anything seemed off. The same clown car was in the basketball court parking lot, parked but with lights on. My friend suggests pulling over, half kidding, but I insist that we keep driving. Anyway, thanks for reading. I've never been scared like that in my life, and I'll never walk home alone again. I would like to thank our channel members before we head into our 2 hours of extra rain. So special thank you to Pamela Curran, Christy Goodall, Paul Reese, Via Mash K0101, Honey Pond, Bitchy Betty, Down Below, Diane Genius, and Inner Scare Wifey. Thank you guys so much for being channel members. I really appreciate it. Good night, everyone, and enjoy the extra 2 hours of rain.